China is a serious long-term challenge, Blinken. China forges on UN chief's remarks on human rights. World Bank boss warns of global recession. IMF says governments should subsidize food. Apple looks to boost production outside China. Novelist murders husband the same as in her novel. Japan established seed protection agency for agriculture. Nike and Marks & Spencer are leaving Russia.
Hello, I'm Wade Lee. Thank you for joining us on FUNDAY News. It is May 27th, Friday, and here are your top stories. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on May 26th described China as the most serious long-term challenge to the international order. China is the only country with both the intent to reshape the international order and, increasingly, the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. In a speech at George Washington University, Blinken said, Beijing's vision would move us away from the universal values that have sustained so much of the world's progress over the past 75 years.
Blinken reiterated that the U.S. policy has not changed and the Biden administration remains committed to a one-China policy. He noted, "We do not support Taiwan independence and we expect cross-strait differences to be resolved by peaceful means." He said, "Our policy has not changed. What has changed is Beijing's growing coercion, like trying to cut off Taiwan's relations with countries around the world and blocking it from participating in international organizations."
The United Nations released a clarification on May 25th of its human rights chief's remarks during a call with Chinese President Xi Jinping, in an apparent suggestion that Chinese state media misinterpreted his remarks. A spokesperson for Michelle Bachelet's office said on May 25th, in a press release sent by email, the UN transcript said that Bachelet stressed in his opening remarks that humans' rights must be at the heart of development, peace, and security, and that China had a crucial role to play within multilateral institutions on issues such as inequality.
But shortly after the video call held earlier in the day, China Central Television published a reading saying that Bachelet had told Xi that she admired China's efforts and achievements in the fields of the eradication of poverty and the protection of human rights. But Bachelet's office said in the email that, in response to widely reported remarks attributed to High Commissioner Bachelet, please find a link here to her actual opening remarks during her meeting with the Chinese president. The office noted the excerpt did not contain anything that could be construed as praising China's human rights achievements.
The president of the World Bank Group, David Malpass, warned on May 25th that Russia's invasion of Ukraine could cause a global recession as the price of food, energy, and fertilizer jump. Malpass told a U.S. business event that it is difficult to see how we can avoid a recession. He also said a series of coronavirus lockdowns in China are adding to concerns about a slowdown. Last month, the World Bank cut its global economic growth forecast for this year by almost a full percentage point to 3.2%.
Malpass said the economies of Ukraine and Russia were both expected to see a significant contraction, while Europe, China, and the U.S. are seeing slower growth, and developing countries are being hit even harder given shortfalls of fertilizer and food stocks and energy supplies. Germany's economy, the world's fourth largest, has already slowed significantly due to high energy prices. Malpass continued by saying the idea of energy prices doubling is enough to trigger a recession by itself.
The managing director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, said on May 22nd, under the twin shock of corona pandemic and the war in Ukraine, food supply chains are curbed and people around the world are struggling with the rising cost of living. Support needs to be provided in a very targeted manner, preferably by providing subsidies directly to people. Governments need to subsidize the cost of food and energy for the poorest members of society.
BBC reported the problems of falling living standards were at the top of the agenda at last week's meeting of G7 finance ministers in Germany. A group of international development bodies, including the IMF and World Bank this week, launched a major plan to try and tackle food insecurity around the world. spearheaded by U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who said it was necessary because there's a very real risk that soaring global market prices of food and fertilizer will result in more people going hungry.
Media reported that Apple has informed contract manufacturers to expand production outside of China, especially to India and Southeast Asia. Apple and its contract manufacturer have been trying to shift productions out of China in recent years. Nikkei Asian Review reported in June 2019 that Apple plans to shift between 15 to 30% of its production capacity out of China to Mexico, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia. The publication also claimed Apple started trial production of the AirPods in Vietnam in the same year.
Economic Times said in May 2020 that Apple was exploring the possibility of shifting almost 20% of its iPhone production capacity from China to India. In 2020, Foxconn invested $1 billion to expand iPhone production in India. Towards the end of 2020, Foxconn reportedly shifted some iPad and MacBook production from China to Vietnam. According to a DigiTimes report that Pegatron also started assembling iPad and MacBook devices in Indonesia from June 2019.
A romance novelist who wrote How to Murder Your Husband was convicted on May 25th in her husband's killing. Following a contentious trial in which prosecutors leaned on a puzzle of circumstantial evidence, they finally portrayed the author as a duplicitous spouse who spent months quietly planning the perfect crime. Media reported the trial began in Portland, Oregon 7 weeks ago. The novelist Nancy Brophy, who is 71 years of age, stood quietly when the verdict was handed down.
Ms. Brophy, who had written the self-published romance novels, had once speculated in a 2011 blog post that a wife who kills her spouse must be ruthless and very clever because she's likely to become a prime suspect. Brophy pondered various methods of murder, supposing that knives were too personal, poison was too traceable, and hitmen were too untrustworthy. She wrote that guns were messy and required skills. In the end, prosecutors contended that Ms. Brophy shot her husband in his workplace.
The Japanese Agricultural Ministry may set up a body to maintain and protect the intellectual property of domestic developers of new plant varieties. Officials say they are looking to work on behalf of the companies to monitor piracy and other illegal activities. They also plan to serve as a go-between to make sure the developers receive licensing fees for their new varieties. The ministry says it'll be setting up a panel of experts, including growers and lawyers, to discuss the proposed organization.
Media reported the proposal was underscored by the discovery of Shine Muscat grapes, a geographical indication fruit of Japan, growing in China without authorization. However, according to Produce Report, Shine Muscat grapes have also been introduced into other countries, including China. Though the quality of China-grown Shine Muscat grapes varies substantially from Japan's, Australia has managed to cultivate 7 new grape varieties bearing the Shine Muscat genes that is expected to come into commercial production in 2020.
Nike and Marks & Spencer will completely leave the Russian market. Nike has stopped supplying products to the Russian market, and all branded stores will close after the stock is sold out. Nike said it would not extend its franchise agreement with Russia's Inventive Retail Group. IRG Chief Executive Officer Tikhon Smukov said in a letter to employees on May 25th that after the goods are sold, IRG will have to shut down all of its shops that are under the Nike name.
At the same time, the British brand Marks & Spencer also decided to leave Russia. The company stopped deliveries in March and has now decided to abandon the Russian franchise altogether. The company cut off supplies to Russia in March, but said earlier that comprehensive franchise agreements did not allow it to withdraw from the business altogether. As for the 50 stores that were still operating, after negotiations, the company said it was completely abandoning the Russian franchise.
And that is all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us on FUNDAY News. Let's make every day a fun day. I am Wade Lee, your host, and I'll see you next time.